from Cedarburg Public Library Radio.
Our first two programs, the one on supply chains and last week's program on China and Africa, featured China and our relationship with them. While China has interest in the Persian Gulf, it is but one of many players and certainly not among the most important. Our presenter tonight is Doug Savage. He did his graduate work at the University of Chicago, one of the country's premier foreign affairs institutions. After graduate school, he worked at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations in Washington, D.C., and as Midwest Regional Director of the U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce, hence his interest in the Middle East. I connected with Doug when he joined the Institute of World Affairs at UWM as Deputy Director and as producer and moderator of the locally acclaimed International Focus TV program. In 2019, I believe Doug was elevated to the post of director of the Institute. We are fortunate to have Doug with us tonight to explain the Persian Gulf, the many actors, outside powers, and the multitude of issues. Doug, take it away.
Well, thank you, John. And I must commend you for your cleverness in inviting me to participate, knowing full well you won't be on the hook for drinks afterwards. So fair play to you.
Yes, I didn't mention that, did I?
Well, thank you. And in terms of format, I mean, obviously this is not a very elaborate and formal presentation. It's a conversation. So I like to think if an academic conference presentation is on one end of the spectrum and a bar stool is on the other end, well, let's skew more towards the bar stool. So with that, I would encourage you as we go along the way, since our path is going to be rather meandering, if you've got a comment or a question, why don't you just interrupt me at that point? Because if we wait till the end, I'm sure we'll all be asleep. So with that, let's get started. Okay. Well, it'll be more interesting to see more than this slide. There we go. Let's start with these 4 questions to kind of bear in mind as we go along. First of all, how and why did the U.S. first get involved in the Gulf? And are these considerations that prompted that involvement still relevant? How has the strategic landscape changed? And what should U.S. priorities be in the region going forward? So let's start our story in the late 1960s when Harold Wilson announced that the Brits, who had pretty much run the show for a very long time, could no longer bear the freight of both the Gulf and their interests throughout the eastern part of the globe. And so he announced that by the end of 1971, they would be pulling out. This was not a decision taken lightly, and they had just been forced to devalue the pound, which they resisted for quite some time. But finally, the math just didn't work any longer, and so that announcement was made. So with the departure of the British sort of keeping order, that led to a bit of a quandary for the U.S., which in 1968 had its own issues. Here you see Richard Nixon referencing 3 principles that he had laid down in Guam, which came to be known as the Nixon Doctrine. The first is that the U.S. will in fact keep all its treaty commitments. Second, if a nuclear power threatens someone we feel is a strategic ally, we will extend our nuclear shield. And for our story tonight, the most relevant is we will provide the wherewithal for our allies in the region to defend themselves so we don't have to provide the manpower. So what that meant was in the Gulf, with the departure of the Brits, we had to cast around for people that could play that role on our behalf. So we looked in the old family album and came up with two people. On the left there, you'll see FDR meeting with the founder of the modern Saudi state. Actually, that's on the USS Quincy in the Red Sea. He made sort of a side trip from the Yalta conference, and very transactional. We would like you, Your Majesty, to keep the oil flowing and to give U.S. concerns a privileged position. And on the right, we've got a more complex story. That's of course, the Shah of Iran. And in 1953, we had engineered a coup, which deposed Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected prime minister. There was an attempt earlier to do that, but under the Truman administration, but Truman didn't go for it. The source of the rub basically was Mossadegh was trying to get some transparency from the Brits, who really ran Iran's oil industry at the time, and they were not forthcoming. And so he nationalized the Iranian oil industry, which of course London did not take kindly to. And so they had approached first, as I say, Truman, and he decided that that was not something he wanted to send the U.S. down the road doing. But when his term ended and Ike came in and the Cold War heated up, basically, they were able to make the case that, well, we've got a flaming communist in Tehran we've got to take care of. And so Eisenhower gave the green light. One of the operatives on the American side involved was the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt, who some of you may know from the annals of the intelligence community. But that did two things in terms of our relationship with Iran. It sort of seared into the brain of the Shah that the communists were out to get him, and he had always best look over his shoulder in that regard. And also his position was guaranteed by the U.S. And so it was a natural that the Shah's Iran and the Saudis would be the two sheriffs that we put into place. So the two pillars then in the Gulf were Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, it's an interesting pairing. And, there's a lot of history there. And let's take a brief digression for some fascinating and additional culture. As the Arabs of the peninsula, what is now Saudi Arabia, expanded out as, they spread the new faith of Islam, the typical policy would be to go to an existing power and give them the opportunity to convert to Islam, and if not, then hostilities would commence. Well, one of the first major powers that they bumped up against was that of the Persian Empire, and the correspondence back and forth has survived in many forms. I think it's an example of me watching too many gangster movies, but I read this first paragraph and hear, sort of Goodfellas or some wise guy about it. I do not foresee a good future for you if you don't submit. And at this point, the Persian Empire had been around for literally millennia and saw itself as the natural hegemon in the region, much like, Rick, you would appreciate this. China sees its position in their part of the world. Like this is the natural order. We, of course, should be the top people. So the response on the part of the Persian emperor, it's a bit lengthy, but I think it's worth it because there's just such great diplomatic snark and disdain. So I'll read it for you. How strange that you occupy the seat of Arab caliph, but are as ignorant as any desert roaming Arab. You Arabs have no regard for God's creatures. who mercilessly put people to the sword, who treat your women, who attack caravans and are highway robbers, who commit murder, who kidnap women and spouses. How dare you pressure to teach us who are above these evils to worship God? You who have spent all your days in brutality and barbarity have now come out of your desolate deserts, resolved to teach by the blade and by conquest the worship of God to a people who have for thousands of years been civilized and relied on culture and knowledge as the art of mighty edifices. I advise you to return to your lizard-infested deserts. Do not loose upon our cities your cruel, barbaric Arabs who are like rabid animals. Refrain from the murder of my people. Refrain from pillaging my people. Refrain from kidnapping our daughters in the name of Allahu Akbar. Refrain from these crimes and evils. We Persians are forgiving people, kind and well-meaning people. Wherever we go, we spread the seeds of goodness, amity, and righteousness. And this is why we have the capacity to overlook these crimes and the misdeeds of your Arabs. Stay in your desert with your Allahu Akbar and do not approach our cities, for horrid is your belief and brutish is your conduct. Well, quite the dressing down, but unfortunately, it didn't carry the day on the battlefield. And Iran, as we know, soon became part of the Muslim world. But I would argue that there is this cultural component that persists until today. And 15 centuries later, let's look at an incident. There is the Hajj, which people are familiar with, I'm sure, the pilgrimage, which happens at the same time for Muslims all around the world. But there's a lesser pilgrimage you can do whenever you have the opportunity, called the Umrah. And in this case, two Iranian families were doing this lesser pilgrimage, and they each had young teenage sons who were pulled out of line at the airport and taken into a back room and allegedly sexually assaulted by the Saudi security personnel. So there's a New York Times piece just explaining it, but then shortly thereafter, the scholar on the right did a deep dive into Iranian social media around the event. And of course, there was criticism and calls for punishment of the responsible authorities. But then, interestingly, he said, there's also derogatory epithets such as unclean dogs, lizard and grasshopper eaters, which seems to be a recurring theme, dirty Arabs and barbarians. Some claim that the incident at the airport was a clear reflection of the Arabs' character and mentality. Now, I share this not to traffic in racism, but rather that I think beyond the politics, there is this cultural component that animates the situation and is responsible for much of the animus. So, for those of you who are still awake, we'll go back to our story. So in 1979, a very important year in the region, one of the pillars falls. Ayatollah Khomeini returns from exile in Iran at the head of a movement that at that point was very heterodox. I mean, the Shah had really lost touch. Some of you may remember the celebration of 5,000 years of the Persian monarchy in the ancient city of Persepolis that he did. And there were while people were hungry in his country, there were accounts of the meals that were prepared, especially for Haile Selassie, one of the guests' dog. So it did not play well. And so Khomeini arrives back in Iran, overthrows the Shah, who at that time was terminally ill with cancer. And so he had to travel around the world like the Flying Dutchman looking for someone to take him in. And so the first pillar fell. And we'll recall that, one of the functions the Shah played was as sort of a bulwark against the Soviets and more generally sort of communism. So you can imagine there was even greater panic when a bit further down the road in that same year, Moscow moves into Afghanistan. For your edification, I've been included a stanza from Rudyard Kipling's 1895 Young British Soldier. When you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plain, and the women come out to cut up what remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains and go to your God like a soldier. So it's the early part of the Graveyard of Empires. So we now have a situation then where the Shah is gone. We've got the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And so in his State of the Union address in 1980, Jimmy Carter stakes out what became known as the Carter Doctrine then. Let our position be absolutely clear. Any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, repelled by any means necessary, including military force. Now, his advisor at the time was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who many of you will remember. In an interview some years later, he was asked if he thought that arming the Mujahideen and all that followed from there was a good idea. And as a consummate Cold Warrior and saw everything through that lens, he said, what's the importance of a few stirred up Arabs compared to the freedom of Eastern Europe? So that was very much in play. And within the Gulf itself, the monarchies were finding things a little worrisome. And so for the first time, they decided to formally create an entity which would allow them to cooperate primarily on economic matters, but there was some thought of some sort of combined security arrangement. And so here you see the beginnings of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, with the members in no particular order other than alphabetically: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, around that time, one of the non-Gulf states decided to be the first to step into the breach and challenge the new Khomeini regime. And of course is Iran. And what commenced for 8 years was really a horrific conflict in which Iraq received substantial aid from both the West and the Gulf states. At the end of it all, 500,000 combatants and 100,000 civilians conservatively were killed, and it resulted in no regime or border changes. Give you some sense of the nature of the conflict. The little graphic on the left up there are victims of an Iraqi chemical weapons attack, and not to be outdone in sort of the awfulness of the conflict. On the right, you see a child soldier in the service of Iran. So it's little wonder Henry Kissinger had his typically pithy remark of, it's a pity they both can't lose. Well, that conflict eventually ended, and Iraq found itself in financial straits. And one of the ways you can take care of your debts is by taking over your creditor. And so the position in Baghdad was, well, actually, Kuwait is an artificial entity, an artifact of sort of 20th century European diplomacy. It was always historically part, and even if you accept that it is a legitimate border, they are engaging in slant drilling in which they're sort of poking their pipeline over the border and siphoning off Iraqi oil. So something has to be done about it. Well, there was a very storied meeting between the then US ambassador, April Glaspie, and Saddam. And her position was, what she was trying to communicate is, unlike with your conflict with Iran, don't look for the US to side with you, and in fact said, we have no opinion on your Arab conflict, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Now, of course, Saddam read that very differently, saying, well, clearly this is a green light. And so that's a story for another time that's oft told, and we all know well what happened after that. He rolled into Kuwait, and that sent shockwaves through the Gulf monarchies. And so here you see George Bush meeting with Saudi King Fahd, and in his address on Iraq's invasion on Kuwait in August of 1990, just a few weeks or after the meeting with April Glaspie, he promises that his administration, like all others stretching back to FDR, is committed to the security and stability of the Gulf. Well, so before the American troops were invited in, there was another offer on the part of the Saudi leadership. There was a prominent Saudi citizen who had a fair amount of battle experience in Afghanistan who said, we don't need those Americans. I've got my guys. That's all really you need. And the Saudi monarchy thanked him for his offer and decided to go with the American military. And he did not take kindly to that. And here he is, saying that when the American troops entered Saudi Arabia, the land of the two holy places, there was strong protest from the religious authorities and from students. It was a big mistake inviting the American troops in, and the Saudi regime lost its legitimacy. Well, of course, that set in motion a series of events which ultimately ended tragically in New York and Washington and Shanksville. So you'll recall the identities of the perpetrators. There were 19 in total. 15 were Saudi of the 19. 2 were from the UAE, and then there was a Lebanese and an Egyptian thrown in there. So if things had been a bit strained before that, they were much more so afterwards. And so if we can look at this little graphic here, this is from the Washington Post, in which President Obama is saying we'll never forget the brave heroes. And then the implication here is here's a sort of caricature of Gulf monarchs saying, yes, our 19 heroes, we won't forget them either. So significantly, in November of 19, there was a poll in Saudi Arabia in which 73% said that good relations with the U.S. was somewhat unimportant or not important at all. And shortly thereafter, a Gallup poll here in February of 2020 showed 65% of Americans have a somewhat or very unfavorable view of Saudi Arabia. So, it's not the warmest and fuzziest of relationships at this point, but, we'll recall that the basis of it early on, since that day on the USS Quincy, was access to petroleum. Well, in 2015, there was a significant day in which there was a paradigm shift in the petrochemical industry. You'll see the top line with the arrow on it is U.S. imports, and the yellow or gold line on the bottom is U.S. exports. And there was a point in 2015 when those lines actually crossed, and the U.S. became a net exporter. So if you're sitting in Riyadh, realizing, as someone once told me in the region, I know you don't love us for our dark eyes, this is not good news. So there's sort of this residual bad blood over 9/11, and now the raison d'etre for the relationship has been seriously eroded. On top of that, around this same time, who do we see playing footsie in the ante room here but Secretary Kerry and his counterpart from Iran? And we have the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which the Obama administration said met the national security interests of the U.S. But the bottom quote here is from Saudi state television, in which basically they said this is a terrible idea. And in fact, it demonstrates we can no longer really count on America. And significantly, we should turn our focus on to Russia and China. And again, this is Saudi state television. So if it hit the airwaves, it was likely to be somewhat reflective of thinking in the palace. Well, along comes the new administration, and people get a reprieve. We see in May 8th of 2018, Donald Trump announces that the U.S. will withdraw from the JCPOA. And I don't know exactly what's going on in this picture, but so there is a feeling that somehow, it had the worst of it had been averted, at least for a while. And meanwhile, within the palace, there was a new player. I thought we'd give the German Federal Intelligence Service a little shout out here. And their estimation in 2016 was Mohammed bin Salman, the son of the king, was a political gambler who was destabilizing the Arab world. So interestingly, he was elevated. He was not directly in line of succession, and his father sort of moved him up and let him jump the queue, and turned him into the crown prince and the heir apparent. And one of the first things he did was an anti-corruption campaign, which involved imprisoning any potential princely rivals and senior businessmen, and allegedly torturing several of them and demanding that their ill-gotten gains be turned over. So we see this certainly in many parts of the world where anti-corruption is used as a tool to liquidate your rivals. He also prosecuted the war in Yemen, which we'll talk in a little bit of detail with in just a minute. Of course, is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the blockade of their GCC neighbor Qatar. So let's talk a little bit about that war in Yemen. 2012, the Saudi-backed candidate is elected president. It was a pretty easy one to handicap since he was the only candidate. But in 2015, a group, the initial core of that group was from a tribe called the Houthi, but it's not strictly along tribal lines, but now that's lent its name to the movement. So, and they became basically Iranian proxies in the conflict with Saudi Arabia.
Doug?
Yes.
When this started, weren't the Houthi not yet under control of Iran? I mean, weren't they rather independent and Iran latched onto it?
Right. Yep. Very much so. So, the enemy of my enemy and all that. So Hadi flees to Saudi Arabia, and a Saudi-led coalition then starts prosecuting this war with U.S. support and funding, because at that point, the administration was happy to lend a hand in anything that would frustrate Iranian machinations in the region. So by December of that year, they're spending $200 million a day on operations in Yemen. But it just grinds on. A few years later, by 2019, is generally considered a stalemate, and there were some very unsavory things going on in terms of the way the war is being prosecuted on both sides, actually. But at that point, the U.S. Senate votes to end American support. And now just this year, President Biden announced that his administration would end all U.S. support for the war. And as part of the consequences of some of those actions, review arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So you see, U.S. Representative Ted Lieu from California, who's on the House Foreign Services Committee, says some of these strikes look like war crimes to me. So some of the things that went on were airstrikes on hospitals and other civilian infrastructure, targeting food production and use of cluster munitions, phosphorus, use of child soldiers, resulting in what the UN considered the greatest humanitarian disaster of our time. So, not a great enterprise to be involved with if your image is important to you. And there were people who were quick to seize on that. Now we come to another character who does not get as much press in this country as Mohammed bin Salman and MBS. But in the region, you hear whenever anyone talks about MBS, they say, no, it's not MBS, it's MBZ, using the British Z. It's Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the Emir of the United Arab Emirates. Significantly, the Emirates has the second largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, behind only China, and commands what I think most observers would say is the most capable, best equipped army. Saudis is bigger, but I was reading an article recently where, for example, the people in the field in Saudi Arabia are loath when the latest round of American weapons purchases come, because now there's something else they have to learn, and they never really figured out how to use the last one. So reminds me of a conversation I had with a British RAF commander in Oman once. He was seconded to the Omani Air Force, and there was a big push at that time to have as much employment as possible go to nationals rather than foreigners. And they took a decision to have the aircraft maintenance done by Omanis, and the Omani pilots all immediately refused to fly. They said, well, we love our brothers, but we know what they're capable of, and we're not getting into any plane that they're maintaining. So this Arab Digest editor, William Law, has a good analysis. He said, in addition to his other roles in the region, MBZ exploits the immaturity, arrogance, and ambition of MBS to achieve his ends. So I liken it a little bit to the clever kid on the playground who finds the bigger kid and says, gee, I bet nobody's brave enough to throw the rock through the principal's window. So you can get what you want done without facing any of the consequences. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest that MBZ, who has the current Saudi king, Salman's ear, was instrumental in having him make the switch and elevating MBS. But PR is PR, and in June of 2019, the UAE announced that it was going to withdraw its troops from Yemen. And it's basically, they are very concerned with their image vis-a-vis the US. You'll see there are some very large weapons purchases in the works, particularly for fighter aircraft, and this just seemed like a loser for them. And so they declared victory after a fashion and left Yemen. Now, another side story, as I said, this is a meandering tale. In June of 2017, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, along with Bahrain and Egypt, decided to sever diplomatic relations with Qatar, which is a very small nation. You'll see here it sort of sticks up like a thumb from Saudi Arabia, and its only connection is this border here. So they banned Qatari registered planes and ships from utilizing their airspace and sea routes, and blockaded the only land crossing. So the question was, what was the issue? Well, there was a list of demands. Basically, the accusation was that Qatar was getting a little too close to Iran, and Also, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a transnational organization that the Gulf monarchies are very wary of. And during the Arab Spring era, Qatar typically came down on the side of the protesters and the people trying to overturn these regimes, whereas the monarchies were virtually united in their support for the status quo. And the reason I took this picture, this is the headquarters of Al Jazeera in Doha. That was one of the demands that was made of them, that they immediately shut down Al Jazeera, which had a reputation of being a little bit too free with their criticism of some of their neighbors. So the thought was, we just have to bring this upstart to heel. But unfortunately for the blockading countries, and primarily, again, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, it's very difficult to put the squeeze on someone whose pockets are as deep as that of Qatar. So if you'll indulge me with a personal photograph, we last time I was there, were invited by a local real estate developer to see his new shopping mall, which was about to open, wasn't quite open to the public yet. So we all were trundled into our vehicles and with visions of Bayshore or Mayfair dancing in our heads. So we were a bit surprised to get to the front door and see this. That is, in fact, all Carrara marble from Italy, which is lovingly installed by Italian marble workers. And he was very keen to tell us that each of these medallions on the floor was unique. There's no repetition. But my point is simply, this is the height of the blockade, and this kind of stuff is going on. It was not without impact, however, and one of the first things that became in short supply was fresh dairy products, because they were no longer able to be brought in over the land border. And so, once again, if you've got the kind of resources that they have, what do you do when you want fresh dairy products? You come to Wisconsin and buy dairy herds, fly them to Qatar, and install them in an air-conditioned, purpose-built dairy in the desert. Now, all of that was well and good on the economic front, but there was clearly a mismatch in terms of military capability. So there was a thought that, well, might the Saudis not cross the border and not worry about the financial side of it? And Qatar had a card to play there too. The El Udeid Air Base, which is the forward base of United States Central Command. So to overrun Qatar, they would have to overrun the base in which U.S. flies all the sorties for that part of the world. So they were guardedly optimistic that there was not a great threat. And so it went on for a while. Al Jazeera reflects on what's going on here. They're saying, all of these efforts were aimed at removing obstacles to Saudi and Emirati regional hegemony. And the success of the plan largely depends on Trump being reelected. And there you see Jared Kushner and his lovely wife with MBS. Supposedly they had a very warm relationship in which they were, texting one another in the wee small hours of the night. And there's a Qatar angle to that too. Supposedly there's the Kushner family has a very high profile real estate development in Manhattan, which was horrifically underwater, and there was a major payment that was due, and they approached the Qatar Sovereign Wealth Fund to bail them out. And after considering for a while, they decided to take a pass. And supposedly, shortly thereafter was when the recommendation was made to the president that in terms of the blockade of Qatar, we should be on the other side and back the Saudis.
Doug,
Yes.
Question from Peter. Why is Qatar singled out? Is it Shia?
No, actually, it's the same version of sort of Wahhabi Sunni Islam as Saudi Arabia, although it's practiced in a less austere manner. I think they were basically too big for their britches from the Saudi perspective.
Trump accused Qatar of financing terrorism. Do they?
Well, they would say no, certainly. And, they've actually played a useful role when the U.S. was trying to engage in the initial dialogue with the Taliban. They agreed to host those efforts in Doha. I don't know. I have never seen anything that's sort of a smoking gun.
But isn't it their connection to Iran that gets that label applied?
It is, and they would be very quick to point out that in terms of just economic activity, trade, the UAE actually has more commerce with Iran than they do. And the source of their wealth is an enormous gas field, which they share with Iran. So they argue, there's just the realities of nature require that we cooperate with them on this thing. And it's not like, we're partisans of Tehran by any means. So a lot of it is, I think the Saudis and the Emiratis really do feel like that the natural pecking order in the region puts them at the top, and people who aren't willing to toe the line and go their own way are problematic. And again, particularly Al Jazeera, it's hard to overstate the irritant that some of the other governments find that to be.
Yes, it's kind of like some of our embassies objecting to the Voice of America and some of its reporting.
Right. So, at the end of the last administration, we have the Abraham Accords signed. Abraham, of course, being a patriarch that's recognized by both Arabs and Jews. The lineage goes through Isaac for the Jewish branch of the family and Ismail for the Arab branch. So some clever person somewhere in Washington came up with that moniker for these agreements. Basically, it's normalizing relations between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. The primary reason, of course, was they have a common animus towards Iran. And so it's a way of sort of solidifying the region against Iran. But they each have other reasons as well. For Israel, it allows Mr. Netanyahu to play peacemaker and deliver better relations with the Arab world while avoiding dealing with the Palestinians in any way. For the UAE, they can look constructive around, again, some of these major purchases, the F-35s particularly, and also they see a complementary opportunities in terms of what they do and what Israel does economically. So there's a thought that there's a lot of money to be made. Bahrain is basically the stand-in for the Saudis. I mean, for those of you who may be a bit rusty on the geography, Bahrain is a very small island connected to Saudi Arabia by a causeway. And Saudi Arabia being the site of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina, has to be a bit more careful with things like a rapprochement with Israel, because that was for so long in the Arab world the non-negotiable red line that no one should cut a separate deal. And in fact, we saw when when Sadat went to Jerusalem and the Camp David Accords, Egypt was in the wilderness for quite a number of years. Interestingly, just in the last day or so, the UAE has expressed some displeasure with Mr. Netanyahu because there was a scheduled meeting that was canceled because he was touting the UAE and MBZ in his campaign literature. As Israel, as you know, is having an election next week. He's saying, see, I brought the Arabs on board. And they were saying, well, wait a minute. We'd prefer you don't use us in your campaign.
Well, Bahrain has also another interesting issue too, in that it's a minority Sunni leadership.
It is, yes, yeah. It's a Shia population and a Sunni, but I mean, they really, for all intents and purposes, do not have an independent foreign policy. I mean, they're really a sort of a wholly owned subsidiary. They would not like to hear this, but of Saudi Arabia. One of those crazy little stories you hear over the years. Supposedly, when things were pretty tight socially in Saudi Arabia, as they remain today, of course, but a little less so in Bahrain. There was the ability to purchase alcohol in Bahrain, and so the common practice became to fill your windshield washer tank in your car with alcohol and drive it back over across the causeway until the border guards got savvy to that and made people wash their windows in front of them about midway through on the causeway. But I digress. So in January of this year, seeing which way the wind was blowing and seeing things not progressing the way the blockading countries would like, all was forgiven and Qatar was welcomed back to the fold. And here you see a shot from the GCC summit in Saudi Arabia, in which MBS and the Emir of Qatar are fast friends once again. So this slide, I think, leads us to some of the Biden administration's recalibration. Freedom House does very good work and produces a report each year on freedom in the world, looking at countries and territories around the world. So on a score of 1 to 100, countries are listed as either free, partly free, or not free. Well, the Kuwaitis this year should be very happy. They made it by 1 point. They just made it over from not free to partly free, but the rest of the GCC countries are well into the not free category, including Saudi Arabia, which is a paltry 7 out of 100 by their estimation, which puts them in the kind of global company you can imagine. I think North Korea is like 2 in their list. So I include this simply because whereas the previous administration had very little thought to such things, here you see President Trump extolling the virtues of large weapons purchases versus the Biden administration, in which campaign statement from candidate Biden said, we'll reassess our relationship with the kingdom and U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, and significantly make sure America does not check its values at the door in order to sell arms or buy oil. And just a few weeks ago, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, says the president's intention is to recalibrate our engagement with Saudi Arabia. So, seeing that, there's a certain amount of bet hedging going on. Here's a quote from an entity John, you're probably familiar with. commenting on Saudi Arabia's intended purchase of Russian S-400 air defense systems and Su-35 jets. The negotiation process is underway. And remember the Saudi state press saying, you know, we can no longer count on these Americans. We should look to the Russians and the Chinese. Similarly, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia was just in Abu Dhabi earlier this month and was touting regular confidential contacts with leaders of the Arabian monarchies and Mr. Putin. Meanwhile, across the Gulf, things are not terribly rosy in the land of the Islamic Revolution. So, mainly due to the sanctions, a third of the population at least lives in poverty. Recent estimates are that year on year, food has increased by 67% last month. And COVID, like everywhere else, has impacted it with an estimated 15% decline in the Iranian GDP. And this last one, I think, is very interesting because remember the raison d'etre of the government is this fervor for the Islamic Revolution. And in recent polling, 32% of Iranian respondents describe themselves as Shia. Most profess no religious affiliation or identify themselves as agnostic, atheist, or Zoroastrian. So 2/3 of the population no longer sees itself as being in the club, which is worrisome if you're the ruling elite.
And those Zoroastrians are holdovers from the grand old days.
Right, right. So where do things stand right now? It's interesting because we're kind of at an impasse. Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, said pretty much the ball is in their court with regard to the JCPOA. The Iranian position is that we were compliant. The American administration under Donald Trump put the sanctions in place, basically abrogating the agreement. And so if you were the first one to break it, it's incumbent upon you to come back into compliance before we can talk. So in February, the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany, who were the signatories on the JCPOA, proposed a meeting in Europe to sort of get talks started, and the Biden administration expressed a willingness to attend. On the other hand, the Iranians said, no thanks. Now, one of the things that had happened in the intervening period was the American strikes, which I think were very measured and not terribly significant in all of this. More importantly, I think the Iranians who have been involved in statecraft for many millennia see that Biden had put a lot of stock in returning to the JCPOA, and they see him as somewhat boxed in, and are unlikely to want to come to the table until they have extracted everything they possibly could. And there's a very real reason to want these sanctions off, because they truly have been effective in that regard. I mean, they've basically ruined the economy. Meanwhile, in all of this, who's looking on but the members of the Gulf monarchy? Here you see the Saudi foreign minister, which seems to have a certain air of panic and desperation to it, saying, well, keep us in the loop, consult us, let us know what's going on. So obviously, they have seen the winds shift markedly between the Trump and Biden administrations. Meanwhile, the other player in all of this is Israel. And when Benjamin Netanyahu met with Biden late in February, you can see here, he told him, with or without an agreement, there's a regime whose flagship goal is to destroy us, and I will do everything I can, everything in my power, to prevent it from attaining nuclear weapons. And so, we have that concern for the Biden administration as well, because at some point, if the perception was there was an existential threat, there's a possibility of unilateral action on the part of the Israelis, which they would not like to see. So let's just look at how the various parties are recalibrating, starting with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They want to continue their efforts to sort of bring the rest of the GCC in line and solidify and expand the anti-Iran coalition, discourage U.S.-Iranian rapprochement, certainly, but then they also have to navigate these new values and priorities of the Biden administration. I think they were very comfortable with the transactional nature of the previous administration and this whole idea of not checking our values at the door to sell weapons or buy oil is not what they wanted to hear. And again, a desire to hedge their bets with engagement with others, including China and Russia. China is less active in the Gulf because they seem to have put most of their chips on the Iranian side of the equation with the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's difficult to play both sides of that. So to the extent that either one is significant, I would say at this point, it seems like Russia is more interested in playing on that side of the water.
Doug?
Yes.
Do you think that by playing the values card, this is a way in which the U.S. is going to be able to reduce or pull out of the Middle East?
Well, that's a question, and again, some of the questions that we started with, what was the original impetus to be there in the first place, and has that changed, including the petroleum scenario, so for Israel, they would very much like to build on the Abraham Accords and become integrated into the regional economy and the security structures. Their goal certainly is to encourage continued U.S. pressure on Iran and discourage a return to the JCPOA, which they were certainly not pleased with. And just to remind everyone, they're still there and they're still willing to use force when needed. You'll see occasional strikes against Iran's proxies, which are now on, page 15 at the bottom these days when some malicious base gets bombed by the Israeli Air Force. We really don't hear much of it.
Doug, we got another question on the Abraham Accords.
Mm-hmm.
They were never given much publicity by the Trump administration. Was that a missed opportunity? What do you think?
Well, I think to the extent that it's not just in response to Iran and is genuinely a way of, promoting, for the UAE, for example, is very interested in some of Israel's high-tech industries. If we could build on that and not have it just be sort of, we're the anti-Iran club, I think it really would be quite significant. Now, of course, the people who are left out in the cold in all of this are the Palestinians. Once Israel becomes sort of integrated into the regional picture with their neighbors, I think there's even less incentive on their part to in any way accommodate Palestinian interests. So, but there's not much they can do about that, the Palestinians. So, there was a lot of sort of disappointed and angry rhetoric, but at the end of the day, that's just
Well, and what is the general attitude of, or not general, what are some Arab countries' attitude towards the Palestinians in this process as well?
Well, I mean, certainly there have been incidents. I mean, the Palestinians were very supportive of Iraq in the invasion of Kuwait. So that is not forgotten. There are long memories in this region, of course. And so that was not good. So the fact that in some cases they were expelled in large numbers after that. Yeah, I mean, the particularly, some of the regimes have always paid lip service to it, but at the end of the day, other than, sort of basic aid here and there to build a hospital here and there, there really was not a deep and abiding diplomatic or political commitment to it. It was useful. It was, we can give you a free press and we can give you political rights after we liberate Jerusalem, kind of thing. It was a useful cause for a while. And I think that's sort of passing from the scene. And I also think there's a generational aspect to it. People like MBS and people of his era did not grow up with the same history and the same, sort of 1948 birth of Israel and, everything that followed from that. So that the idea of having a more, again, transactional relationship is no longer something that's beyond the pale for a lot of people. Well, let's look at Iran. They will continue to test Biden's need for a deal by insisting on the dropping of sanctions. And interestingly, much has been made of them sort of abandoning the terms of the JCPOA, but they've been very, very careful. And there's really nothing that's been done to date that couldn't very easily be walked back. So, for example, enriching uranium, I think it was some odd number of 9-point-something% they could do under the terms of it. Weapons grade is like far more than that. They've said they're going to start enriching it to 20%. So they're not saying we're going to enrich it to weapons grade immediately. They curtailed the inspector's ability, but didn't throw them out of the country. So they really would like to see the deal be back in place, obviously on their terms, so that they've been very careful in sort of abandoning the terms. And again, nothing that couldn't be walked back. They'll want to continue the perception of their regional influence and their natural place as the hegemon with these armed proxies. And they'll also maintain an open line to the P5+1 governments. There was something recently where they were responding to a report of communication between the U.S. via the Swiss, and they were trying to downplay that, saying, "Oh no, we're not talking to the Americans, but it's natural that we would, sort of keep
We're
the
always
door
talking."
open." Right. And then significantly, the most important thing I think they'll need to do is just manage domestic unrest. Again, the sort of revolutionary zeal on the part of the population has long since waned, and people are in very hard economic straits at the moment. And again, there's a generational aspect to it. I mean, there are people who didn't grow up under the Shah who just grew up not being able to dance in public. So we saw on a few occasions, largely after elections, really significant unrest and uprising. So we've got an election coming up in June. So we'll see what happens there.
Elections.
And finally, the United States. What should we be doing? And I would argue, we should continue to engage with Iran as far as possible, but we can't appear to fold, despite Biden perhaps boxing himself into a corner, or doing anything that will alarm our regional allies, particularly the Israelis. I think we should encourage the Abraham Accords framework. That could be very useful and beneficial to everybody. But again, prevent Israel from feeling the need for unilateral military action. And then finally, as the administration has made clear, they're going to be less transactional than the previous administration and use values to inform some of their decision making. So I guess our exit question is, what are our policies and priorities right now going forward? So with that, I would thank you for your attention and open it up to a wider discussion.
I'll start with an observation, is when we try to make decisions between values versus interests, there are costs and consequences to both of them. And there needs to be priorities. And I don't think in this particular case, I think we're leading with our hearts and not our brain.
Well, they were very calibrated. I thought the Biden response to the release of the intelligence report on the Khashoggi murder was interesting. I think just today he made a statement about why he did not sanction MBS. And he said that would have been without precedent, that the U.S. sanctions a allied head of state, so that we can do up to, but not including the top responsible party.
Okay. Just Rick.
So I'll ask the question from the China viewpoint. As you pointed out in one of your early graphs, the crossover point where the U.S. is no longer the major importer, we're no longer importing more oil than we're exporting from the Middle East, then the logic for us to be the gatekeeper or the referee in the Middle East maybe it doesn't apply like it used to apply. And on the other hand, China is highly dependent on the Middle East, and we're spending all our resources to ensure that they have a stable supply of oil. Why don't we turn it over to China?
Right. Well, I mean, and that's a fair argument to be made.
But isn't that what's sort of happening anyway? I mean, not just China, but Russia and other regional powers beginning to play more of a prominent role in how we look at this.
Right.
Well, Russia's screwing around in Syria, and China has their base. Is it Djibouti and Somalia?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not really the Persian Gulf. So I'm not saying we should do this. I'm being deliberately provocative, since you know a lot more about this region than I do. Why should we continue our present role is my question. Because of Israel?
Right. Well, I mean, if the initial two priorities were keeping the Soviets out and securing access to cheap oil, well, obviously the Soviets are no longer an issue, and nor is from the U.S. perspective, to the extent that it once was anyway, access to the oil. So, yeah. And the other sort of successor issue was their assistance in countering terrorism. And there's a certain skepticism about, their willingness to do that. I mean, Saudi Arabia particularly played the game for decades, in which it promoted the kinds of movements that could sort of metastasize into violent extremism abroad. So they funded madrasas, the schools in Muslim countries in Africa and all over the world, and basically it's like, okay, yeah, fine. If you people want to be, sort of, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said, stirred up Muslims, you can do it somewhere else in the world. Just stay out of the kingdom. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a interesting point. I mean, and really that's one, it'd be interesting to.
Well, and those countries don't talk to any of the Middle Eastern countries or the Persian Gulf countries about their human rights violations.
Yeah, there is that too. I mean, again, unless, the previous administration was less squeamish about that sort of thing, but right. I mean, that's an advantage that China particularly has in many places around the world. They say, we want copper at this much a ton, and how you get it to us is your business. So, yeah, we don't hector them about, well, the copper miners' rights of being violated. So,
Peter, anything? Your mic.
You're being Marcel at the moment. There you go.
No, I was just, I always thought that it was just, a remarkable abuse of any framework of civilization, what was going on in Yemen and continues to this day. And I'm just stunned and amazed reading about that place and looking at the International Rescue Committee numbers and stuff like this about what they're doing there. And so my only cynical reaction is, so much for Arab brotherhood and Muslim solidarity, and blowing the living daylights out of people left and right with Raytheon, laser connected missiles. And, I just, that one, it would seem to me, with 14 million people out of a population of 29 million, so half your population in Yemen, it seems to me would have reverberations for, the next 50 years in all of that area, and in that hugely strategic area. But because of the fact that, it's Yemen and they produce khat, and
right.
this mild narcotic, and as well as labor, for the Gulf and for Saudi Arabia and places like that, doesn't elicit the same type of, strategic impulses, I think, that might otherwise be there. But
it's an interesting Sudani connection in that conflict as well.
Yes. And with Sudanese soldiers, with Sudanese army guys coming, yeah. And the Sudanese have done this stuff, as you probably know, in various places in that particular part of the world too.
Right.
They've been at war for so long. When you could even argue since 1956, when they gained independence and the South rebelled. And they've been fighting in one form or another, other than an interregnum, for about 8 or 9 years there in the mid 70s, the early 80s. But
Doug?
Yes.
We've been looking at the relationship between the Sunni Arabs and Iran. But is this really a Sunni Shia kind of relationship, or is this a Persian Arab kind of relationship?
Well, I think, again, as we said at the outset, there, in most regions of the world, there is someone who thinks they are the natural hegemon. And when they're not, it's an aberration, and certainly that's the case with China, right, Rick? So I think that's the case with Iran. I mean, they think, of course, we should be, the big dog on the block. And again, yeah, I mean, as I tried to get across, there is this cultural animus. I mean, they would say, for 5,000 years, there was a very high level of Persian culture. Now, who are these people to just by, the luck of geology that gave them oil under their sand to try to play that role?
Well, we're coming up on the magic hour. One last question.
Well, I guess continuing my line of questioning, what should the role be of the United States in foreign policy in the future? Are we to continue to being the post-World War II referee in all these regional conflicts, or should we have a different, more self-interest driven role? That's just my question. I don't know the answer. I don't have an opinion on what the answer should be.
Right. And that, there are examples of that in this part of the world, but it pertains everywhere.
Yes.
What is the role? I mean,
why are we fighting in Afghanistan? Kissinger made the point that China's getting a free ride in Afghanistan, controlling the Uyghur and separatists that are fighting across the border. Well, have we overreached?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like it. And again, there was an era where there were very clearly identified interests, particularly in the Gulf. And I don't know, has that era passed? I mean, do we no longer have an abiding reason to be the sheriffs in the region? Because it seems like we no longer have reliable proxies the way we once did. I mean, for all his many shortcomings, in his heyday, the Shah of Iran was, a pretty effective force in the region.
Well, at that time we were trying to protect our oil and keep Russia out.
Right.
But that game is over.
And the Abraham Accords, they really bother me because it was from the United States point of view, was to prop up Trump's reelection, and from the Israeli point of view, to prop up Netanyahu's reelection, and put us right in the middle of the Sunni-Arab conflict.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens next week in Israel. Netanyahu has defied the odds on many occasions, but I don't know. He's one step ahead of the sheriff this time around with his indictment. So.
He'll get reelected.
Well, Doug, thank you very much.
It was really excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
And with humor. And I owe you at least 2 glasses of wine.
I won't say no.
And next week, we end up this 2021 Great Decisions with Peter Kranstover asking the question, globalization? And also, thank you to the Cedarburg Friends of the Library for sponsoring this program. Mary, thank you, and your people.